Hey guys, it's Trafotin. January is a slow week when it comes to tech news, but I go away for 1 week and all of a sudden there's drama in the Linux community. The one thing that always grinds the gears of supposed Linux users online is anything involving the Linux Foundation. I'm going to break down a recent story of the Linux Foundation, because there always seems to be a ton of negative sentiment from random people online, and I want to properly evaluate the situation, and I also want to take this time to examine why the Linux Foundation makes the decisions that they do. The Linux Foundation, who are stewards of various projects across the open source world that you may or may not have heard of, made an announcement of the Supporters of Chromium-based Browsers initiative. The initiative promises to raise funding and development support for other projects that use Chromium. So there's quite a bit to unpack here, but I think it's important when we read about issues like these, we don't want our opinions to be shaped by journalists or content creators or anything anyone on the internet said. When we look at situations like these or material about the news online, we want to have the source material ready, so that way, when we come to our own conclusions, we do so as educated adults. So before we get started, the first thing I want to do is dive into Google's antitrust rulings in the last year. More specifically, I feel like Google's antitrust rulings in the last year are very related to why the Linux Foundation and Google are making the decisions that they are. Here in the United States, Google has been under a lot of pressure from regulators, and is now officially a convicted monopoly. The question is, what remediation is going to be done to Google to rectify the damage that they have done to the market? Enter United States of America et al. Versus Google, which breaks down the final judgment the court made in November 2024. And this is what the court writes. The remedy must prevent Google from frustrating or circumventing the court's final judgment by manipulating the development and deployment of new technologies like query-based AI solutions that provide the most likely long-term path for a new generation of competitors, who will depend on the absence of anti-competitive restraints to evolve into full-fledged competitors and competitive threats. Now, it's a bit wordy, but the important thing here is when we look at something like when the court refers to query-based AI solutions or search engine technologies, they're talking about broader technologies that are used to spread Google's reach and prevent future competitors from coming in to take their place. And what's actually really interesting is key to the federal government's arguments is they cite Microsoft antitrust cases, which is everywhere where you see Microsoft in parentheses. And this is what the court writes. Google's ownership and control of Chrome and Android, key methods for the distribution of search engines to consumers, poses a significant challenge to effectuate a remedy that aims to, quote, unfetter these markets and anti-competitive conduct, unquote, and, quote, ensure that there remains no practice likely to result in monopolization in the future, unquote. Now, whether or not the selling of the Google Chrome web browser or Android will come to pass is another thing entirely. And a lot of political pundits and commentators say that the incoming Trump presidency will either see this through or not. Only time will tell. Regardless of what happens, the threat of Google not being able to own an open source project might also come bundled with clauses that prevent Google and its developers from working on Chromium anymore. Because it's really important to remember when we talk about Chromium isn't just the web browser space, although that's what most people think about. It's also in stuff like Electron-based applications. Have you ever used Discord or VS Code? Those are all based on Chromium, or Electron, but it's basically Chromium. There's also the Chromium embedded frameworks, which is included in a lot of applications, like the live chat on a YouTube live stream, or Steam. Because yes, did you know Steam uses a Chromium embedded framework so you can browse and buy things in the store? But the long and short of it is Chromium is popular, and lots of projects use it. By their own disclosure in their own announcement of the Supporters of Chromium-based Browsers initiative, Google represents 94% of all contributions to Chromium. And by getting the Linux Foundation involved, Google is getting more benefit from the open source nature of Chromium, and by opening the initiative, that means Google gets more non-Google voices to help develop Chromium. This way, in a situation where the world is stuck with an undeveloped Chromium that cannot have the help of Google, Chromium will be protected as a project because there will be more voices to steward it if Google cannot. Despite the name, the Linux Foundation isn't just about Linux, nor should they feel obligated to invest or give money to anything other than the interest of its members and the projects that it runs. Google happens to be a paying member of the Linux Foundation, and while they have not donated the Chromium trademark, having a framework like supporters to Chromium-based browsers might be the road for Google to donate the trademark in the future. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, because all of this is very future-facing. A lot of people online would have you believe that the goal of the Linux Foundation is to raise money for the Linux desktop. But this isn't true when we consider two major components: the mission statement of the Linux Foundation and the financial responsibility the Linux Foundation has to its members. And they actually list their mission statement in their bylaws, which is really important to analyzing how the Linux Foundation makes the decisions that it does. And this is from the Linux Foundation's mission statement. The purposes of this corporation are to support, promote, protect, and standardize Linux and other open source software and technologies. So if we take these goals, how does the Linux Foundation serve its mission statement by making something like the Supporters of Chromium-based Browsers initiative? Well, I actually see nothing wrong here, because this entire initiative sounds completely in line with the Linux Foundation's mission statement. Chromium is open source software, and it's a reasonable argument that it's a standard because of how many projects use it, and an initiative like the Supporters of Chromium-based Browsers would protect Chromium in the event that Google couldn't develop it, and it would also give it neutral governance because Google can't develop it anymore. Now, I know a lot of people won't be happy about this, but let's say an organization like the Linux Foundation were to give money to the Mozilla Foundation. When nonprofits swap money this way, there's going to be a lot of attention from tax regulators, and in a worst case scenario, if the investigation goes sour, the Linux Foundation and the Mozilla Foundation could lose their nonprofit status. Now, that's a worst case scenario, but it's also really important to think about why. Nonprofits are supposed to be spending all of their money, not just giving it away to anyone who asks. They can't give money to the GNOME Foundation or to the KDE EV for the same reasons, because they're nonprofit foundations and it could cause them to run afoul of tax law. The Linux Foundation, when they spend money on a cause, they can't do it when it would replace work in the organization that they're giving money. Contrary to the Mozilla Foundation, the GNOME Foundation, or the KDE EV, Chromium has no foundational support. Again, Chromium is sponsored by a company. And Chromium's developers, as well as Google, have expressed that they have no interest in opening a foundation for Chromium anytime soon. And because there's no foundation, that means that the initiative is also open to other browser makers who want to contribute, like Opera and Microsoft, not just Google. Because after all, the goal of the project is to increase non-Google voices in Chromium, right? Because diversity should be a strength in developing a project, and therefore when there's more non-Google voices, it makes the project better for everyone, and it could even loosen some of the control that Google has over it. All of this, I understand, is a big if, and all based on future promises of stuff that might happen, and this is true. But I think another argument that people bring up is Google is purely doing this to look good. The problem that I have with this statement is if Google's trying to look good, they're being very quiet about it, and they're not doing a very good job with it. When Google typically wants regulators to notice things, they usually try to put out a public statement, like say on social media, like on Twitter or Facebook, or even just a public announcement on their blog. And that's what I'm going to bring up here. And this is Google's blog, the keyword. So for example, Google used the keyword to dispute a ruling from the UK's Competition and Markets Authority way back last year. And in this way, the Linux Foundation was different from Google because they used their equivalent newsroom to make their announcement. And the reason why I think this conflict emerged is because a lot of the online critics of the Linux Foundation just cannot stand that the darling desktop Linux is not going to get the development at the same level as server or embedded device Linux users. Now, the natural distrust of companies like Google play a big role into this, or even mega million-dollar foundations like the Linux Foundation. But all this discourse really tells me this is an example of what desktop users shouldn't be. And if you are doing this, you need to stop immediately and think about what you are saying before you just type something on Reddit or whatever. If desktop Linux users are going to be begging the Linux Foundation to give money to desktop Linux, how come the same people will stab the Linux Foundation in the back for using their spending and resources appropriately to serve members who give them millions of dollars and steward technologies that are used in majority markets like in servers or IoT devices? I know this is a lot to take in, and this is probably not the message that people want to hear, but if you want the Linux Foundation to give money to desktop Linux, the only way that's going to happen is if there are better financial measures in place to collect this money to even make this possible, and market share for people to use Linux to make it and convince them that it is even worth their time to begin with. Because 3% of however many people on this planet is not remotely enough to convince anyone. It's not enough to convince PC makers. It's not enough to convince the Linux Foundation.
If you pay the Linux Foundation, they must fix the Linux desktop.
I mean, good luck with that. Yeah, they're going to say, actually, that's good that you asked that. They're going to say the same thing everyone else will tell you. Show me the money.
Man, I can't wait for all of the dislikes of people who told me I got paid off by the Linux Foundation. And if you are interested in any of the sources that I used for this video, I recommend that you visit my website, Trafotin.com. I have a full transcript of everything I've just said in written form if you don't want to watch the video, and you can also look up sources to corresponding parts of the videos. So that way, you get a full perspective of what I'm coming from, and you can tell me if I'm full of crap or not. As always, if you like the work that I do, leave a like on the video, subscribe, and you can also donate me money through Patreon, YouTube memberships, or cryptocurrency. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next time, and have a great rest of your week.